Jenkins, University of British Columbia. We've got about knowing our own hearts, self-learning, science.
Thank you very much. And as it is the final session of this very successful conference, I thought we should take a moment just to acknowledge and thank the organizers, especially Lucas and Kagan, wherever he is, who've made this such a brilliant event. So thank you. And of course, all of the graduate speakers who've come here and succeeded in what I'm told is a very competitive, selective situation to get a spot on this program. So well done as well to all of you. So I'm going to talk about one of the epistemological problems that hit me when I started working on the nature of romantic love. And just the very first thing, actually, that I want to say about that is that I will sometimes just say the word love to mean romantic love. And that's not because I don't think there are other kinds of love, and they're really important, of course. It's just because it's a convenient shorthand. So that's just a quick terminological caveat to start off with. What I really want to flag or draw attention to with this paper that I'm writing, which incidentally, this is the first time I've actually presented this material in public, so I hope you're going to bear with me if I mangle any parts of it. But, the thing I'm really trying to get at is the idea that the epistemological complexities of understanding love are really not being given their due. Okay, so people are not noticing that there are some major issues here. And of course, we sort of expect that from popular media and from journalism and, sensationalizing headlines and so on. But I'm not just talking about that. I'm talking also about the science, the journals the peer-reviewed journals in which scientific studies about romantic love are appearing, and also in philosophy. I think nobody is quite, as far as I know, to my knowledge anyway, pinning down the sorts of methodological worries that I'm having. And so the core aim of this paper is really just to make some of them more visible. There's a secondary aim as well, which is I'm going to worry about what to do about them. But honestly, if I don't convince anybody about what we should do about it, that would be fine, because really I just want to make more people start to have a bit of a think about the problems here. Okay, so what I'm really up to came about because I started thinking initially about the metaphysics of love. And so I was trying to answer questions like, what is love? Is it real? Is it natural? All those kinds of things. And very quickly, the question struck me what to do with the science. Because there's a lot that the science of love is telling me a lot of things, says a lot of things about the nature of romantic love. And some days, I feel like it would be really nice to be a straight-up hardcore reductionist, biological reductionist, naturalistic as you like, and just say, well, we're philosophers, we're just going to sit back and wait for science to tell us the answer to questions like, what is love, right? Eventually, biologists or the psychologists or whoever it is that's in their domain will just tell us the answer. That's Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, I take a day off philosophy on Sunday. Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, I'm a hardcore social constructionist who's totally convinced that the entire thing is made up in the sense of being created by our social norms. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go along. But when I'm feeling like I would love to be more of a naturalist and a reductionist, I was initially hoping, can I just read the journals and learn the answer from that? And pretty quickly I realized there were some issues with doing that. And the one that really struck me the most, and the one that I'll talk about most in today's talk, is this really heavy methodological reliance on self-reporting throughout the science of love. And this reliance comes in two forms, at least two forms. These are the two major ones. Firstly, in selecting subjects into a study. So basically, researchers are asking, are you in love? Okay, come do our study. right? Or for finding correlations. So they'll accept anyone into the study, and then when they're looking for, correlations with, say, activation in certain regions of the brain, or correlations with psychological factors, or whatever it is, then they ask, so are you in love? Okay, let's look at your fMRI scan. Okay, so this was sort of starting to, it was starting to worry me. What I decided to do was take a look at basically the most recent stuff that I could easily get hold of. So I looked at only peer-reviewed studies that were published between 2010 and 2015, with the thought being I don't want to be looking at stuff that's obviously out of date, so I want the current best science of love. So these studies then became my data points for sort of exploring what this reliance on self-reports was doing to the methodology, the epistemological profile, really, of the scientific work that was coming out. And I'm looking across various disciplines, but especially neuroscience journals and psychology journals, lots of stuff in both of those. And the one thing that really sort of jumped out immediately was that the conclusions in a lot of these studies were reported as being conclusions about love, about romantic love, not conclusions about self-reported love. Okay, so it really was the case that the step was being made from the kinds of ways that people would identify and the kinds of claims they would make about themselves, their experiences, and so on. A step was being made from all of that to a conclusion about what love is like. So given, and sometimes you'd see these sort of caveats in the methods section saying, oh, well, there's some things you might want to worry about here. But by the time you get to the conclusions, and I'll show you some examples of this happening, by the time you get to the conclusions, they're reported as just being what we've learned about love. So it's not surprising, that by the time this makes the popular media, it's like the biggest discovery we've ever made about the nature of love. Scientists can tell if you're in love by scanning your brain. They can tell if you're faking it. That's actually a real headline, came out quite recently. Okay, they can't. Heads up, spoiler alert. So look at some examples of the kind of thing I'm talking about, just to give you a sense of it. So the first kind of reliance on self-reporting that I mentioned is for the selection of subjects into a study. So one example of this was a study conducted by Ziki and Romea, published in 2010, in which the subjects, this is a quote from probably from the methods section, subjects were recruited through advertisements requesting volunteers who are passionately in love. So you come along and you say, yes, I'm passionately in love, and then you're accepted into the study. Okay, so what they say about what they were studying is this. I'm going to quote just a fairly lengthy passage of text because you sort of need all the context to see what I'm saying here. They said the main aim of what they're up to was to determine whether there are any differences in the pattern of brain activity between males and females and heterosexuals and homosexuals when they view pictures of those they love, which amounts to inquiring whether there is any difference between male and female or heterosexual and homosexual brain patterns in response to romantic love. Our results have shown no differences in the pattern of brain activation produced in these different groups. So, super interesting result, actually, super interesting study, fantastic. But the thing I want to draw attention to right now is that they're not mentioning self-reports here. They're not mentioning that was part of the methodology. So that was one example. Another example, slightly more recent, from Ladowski and Dunbar, published in 2014. Here, the participants, participants were recruited, I'm quoting again probably from the method section, but from the paper. Participants were recruited from students and staff of the University of Oxford using posters and emails advertising for participants who considered themselves to be, quote, truly, madly, deeply in love with their current romantic partner. So again, it's what you consider yourself to be. What you say you are gets you into the study. Okay, and then what they said was that they, quotes, found that when individuals who are in love with a romantic partner were primed with a picture of their loved one, performance on a subsequent mentalizing task was improved. Again, super fascinating, very interesting. But here, there's almost maybe a little bit of a gesture to this. There are at least scare quotes around in love. Maybe that's a little bit of a gesture towards the fact that they were self-reporting. But if that is what that's meant to indicate, it's certainly not made clear in this passage. One more example. Actually, I'm going to skip to identification of correlation. So those were examples of using how people describe themselves or their experiences to recruit into the study. Now I'm going to look at some examples of where self-reports were used to identify correlations between love-related phenomena and other things. So number one, I've got this Bringle et al. Study from 2013, in which subjects were given questionnaires to self-report on various love-related experiences and other phenomena. The questionnaires are based on much older piece of work by Hendrick and Hendrick, published in 1989, and I flagged that date there. And I'm going to come back to the reason why I flagged that date there, but for now I'll just sort of leave that sitting there. The study I'm talking about was published in 2013, but it's using a questionnaire that was developed much earlier. Okay, so they were given these questionnaires to self-report on things like whether they were in love and what it was like for them. And then the responses from that questionnaire were used to identify correlations between different factors that they were investigating. And their conclusions include, again, completely fascinating. Unrequited love was found to be quite distinct from equal love, that's reciprocated love, in terms of the intensity of each component of love, so various different components of love that they were looking at. Another example, similar kind of thing, from Song et al. 2015. Subjects here were sorted via interview responses into an in-love group, an ended-love group, basically just been dumped, and a single or never-in-love group. And the in-love subjects were then asked to self-report further on more specific things using another scale developed in the 1980s known as the Passionate Love Scale. It comes out of Hatfield and Sprecher, 1986. And the conclusions here include basically what they were, I'm not going to try to read all of that, but what they were looking at was different patterns of activation in regions of the brain that they knew to be interesting for other reasons. But notice what they're describing here, love-related alterations. So alterations that were correlated with being in love, not reporting yourself as being in love. That's the kind of thing that I want to flag. Okay, so let me now raise some, I hope I've convinced you I'm talking about happens. And I want to raise some sort of general epistemological issues about it before I transition into things that are more specifically interesting with respect to the epistemology of love in particular. Firstly, of course, the benefits of using self-reporting methodologies are huge, and I don't want for a minute to be taken to be underestimating them. Right? It's relatively speaking easy to ask somebody, are you in love? What's it like? It's inexpensive, relatively speaking. But here's a more interesting one. You normally expect people to be reasonably authoritative on things like this. And you normally expect them to be sort of distinctively authoritative. I mean, who's going to know better than you whether you've been in love and if you have, what it was like and things like that. But here's an even more important one. Like, what else are you going to do? If you want to identify, say, what part of your brain goes off when you're in love, if you have a question like that in mind, what else are you going to do except ask people to identify the correlations with what's going on in their brains? So look, all of that's definitely there, and I'm not underestimating the significance of it. When I say we normally expect people to be sort of authoritative or distinctively authoritative, I don't mean infallible, obviously. Nobody expects infallibility. In fact, contemporary epistemologists rarely assume the infallibility of self-reports on any matter, and being in love certainly isn't luminous, right? We didn't need to wait for Timothy Williamson to tell us this. I could also refer you to literally the plot of every rom-com ever, which just wouldn't work if it was luminous, whether or not you were in love. But fallibility is not a problem per se, right? Just being, capable of being wrong about whether you're in love or about what it's like and so on. That doesn't mean we have to throw in the towel and just give up here. Right? That's not the kind of worry that I have. The kinds of worries that I have I'm still in the area of general issues now, but I'm starting to home in a little bit on where I'm going. Sort of worries that I have concern things like selection effects. So one thing that was happening in some of these studies, and I gather this is just a fairly common practice, is that incentives were being offered, like money or course credit, for participation in the studies. And that's going to have some interesting effects just generally on the kinds of results that you're likely to see. The other kind of sort of general epistemological worry that I have here is that subjects who are willing and able to self-report a condition might not be fully representative of all subjects in the condition, right? Some of them might not be aware they're in the conditions. Some people might be unwilling to talk about it if they are. Some of them might be unable to talk about it, right? They may be too busy or too far away, or they don't have access to the internet or whatever it is. I mean, all these kinds of things are general worries about relying on self-reporting methodologies in science. There's a lot of work out there sort of exploring and unpacking all of those things. And the same goes for the issue of biases in self-assessment. So we're, as is now I think fairly well known, we're prone to certain specific kinds of bias in assessing ourselves, including self-serving biases. So basically attributing our past successes to our own hard work and diligence and skill and talent, and our own failures to external causes that were completely beyond our control. Somewhat relatedly, we're prone to wishful thinking, right, assuming that things that we would like to be true are true. We're prone to confirmation biases, which means, the thing where we'll ignore all the evidence that shows that we're wrong and focus in on the evidence that confirms the thing we already believe to be true. And these are naturally going to have the result that the kinds of self-reporting that happen in these studies, or indeed any other studies that rely on self-reporting, are going to be somewhat overly positive and moreover ignore or discount any conflicting any evidence that doesn't fit with the rosy narrative. Okay, so those are just general epistemologicals with reliance on epistemological issues with reliance on self-reporting. I want to talk now a little bit more specifically about what happens in the science of romantic love. And I'm going to start with what I've called the, I'm very sad, the paper's gone to print now, but I didn't think of this acronym quite in time. The CCC Effect, so the studying of comfortable and clear cases of romantic love. And I've used scare quotes for clear for reasons that I'll explain in just a moment. But I'm going to start with what I call the comfortable cases. What I mean here is that talking about love is not something that everybody is entirely comfortable doing, especially on a personal level. So in asking people to, come to the lab or wherever you are as a researcher and discuss their, the intimate details of their personal life, the thought is that's not something everybody's entirely willing to do, right? So you're selecting for people who are willing to reveal details in an interview with a stranger or in a survey that, for all they know, could be read by anyone. And that, I would imagine, I can predict, is going to be correlated with things like openness, personality trait of openness, and also things like lack of social awkwardness and lack of social anxiety that you might feel in an interview about your personal life with a stranger. There's also going to be, so people who are just comfortable talking about love basically are going to be somewhat overrepresented. There's also pressure, social pressure exists not to acknowledge, not to admit to kinds of love that are considered to be wrong in your social context. So you can imagine in highly conservative social situations, same-sex love is going to be underreported because you're not going to be comfortable. This is not going to be a comfortable case for discussion. So there's going to be a somewhat predictably skewed sample of kinds of love under discussion, under study. The other kind of skewing that I'm interested in is the skewing towards clear cases, and here I mean that in order to self-identify as someone who is in love, you not only have to be comfortable talking about it, but you have to think that that's what's happening to you, right? You have to be reasonably confident that it's true. So if you're just someone who is very confused or very unsure about, say, what even counts as love, what is this thing, then you're probably correspondingly less likely to self-report being in love. So now I actually happen to think that the question of what love is really hard and philosophically interesting and complex and tangled. So I think being very confident in self-reporting that you are in love might be a way of selecting for confident types, right? Because love is just confusing. And maybe selecting out the more cautious or philosophical people who are more likely to be confused and just wondering whether the thing that they're doing, whatever it is, counts as love or not. With the predictable result that the studies become, again, less representative of how love is experienced in generality and more a matter of studying the clear cases, or the cases that feel clear from the inside, as it were. Well, this is interesting to me, partly because confidence, having a decisive answer to questions like whether you're in love, difficult questions like that, might track not only your individual temperament, but perhaps also differences in status and or social conditioning within different groups. So if, for example, being very decisive and confident is rewarded in, say, men and penalized in women, this might be the kind of thing that could impact how liable people are to have a decisive and confident answer to the question whether they are in love in these studies. But in some cases, it might just be that people are unaware that love is so much as possible given their situation. And here, I'm connecting up with the literature on hermeneutical injustice that's already come up at least once during this conference. It's a notion that's due to Miranda Fricker in 2007. And my favorite statement of what it is it's a situation where prejudicial flaws in shared interpretive resources prevent subjects from making sense of an experience which it is strongly in their interests to render intelligible. And so in this particular context, you can imagine, for example, queer people who only know of pejorative words or pejorative concepts to describe their own orientation or relationships. Love, the word love, is typically very strongly positively valenced. And this, in fact, is one of the reasons why, if you are in this sort of very conservative mindset, you try to withhold the term love from same-sex relationships, right? Because you're trying to withhold approbation, in effect. So the risk is that some kinds of love are not going to be transparent precisely because of the effects of hermeneutical injustice on just knowing that those are, in fact, indeed kinds of love. Failing to notice that the existence of certain kinds of love is not only a risk for the subjects, this is actually something that's going to impact the researchers as well. And in fact, the whole of this CCC effect can manifest at the level of the researchers as well as at the level of the subjects. And when it's impacting the researchers, what it's going to do is just alter which studies they run in the first place and how they structure them, for example. So, if we were all still going around assuming that romantic love has to be, quotes, between a man and a woman, which is an old, very common definition in like 1970s or 1980s era philosophy of love, then studies like Ziki and Ramaya 2010 wouldn't exist. Remember, that was the one where they were noticing that the straight people had the same patterns of brain region activation when they viewed photos of someone they were in love with as the gay couples. And the study wouldn't exist. It wouldn't have been conducted. So the same sorts of factors are going to be sort of compounded by their impact, not just on the subjects who are self-reporting, but by the researchers who are collecting the self-reports. So one example is the potential exclusion of queer cases. In contemporary studies, what you find is that researchers are almost always investigating only monogamous love. So I mentioned this Hatfield and Sprecher 1986 love scale. That's the questionnaire they use to assess whether you're in love or not. And it includes questions which you're supposed to agree or disagree with, like I would rather be with person X than with anyone else, or that's the person who can make me feel the happiest, that are diagnostic for monogamous love. But if you're in love with two people and you don't have a favorite, then you would disagree with these statements. Correspondingly, the scale would decide that you're less in love. And the reason I want to sort of draw attention to things like that scale is that although it's old, it's still, in contemporary work, the yardstick. So it's actually used in all of these studies that were among the ones I looked at, and O'Leary et al. 2012 describe it, I assume correctly, because I assume they know what they're talking about, as the most widely used measure of romantic love. But despite the fact that it's being used in all this contemporary work, it's 30 years old. So it does things like, it asks about things like, how do you feel when you're sitting looking at the person? There's a lot of stuff about sort of personal face-to-face contact and how that feels, and it's sort of just, as far as I can tell, it's ignoring the complexities of love in the time of Snapchat, which may be a little different from what, the stereotype of romantic love looked like in the 1980s. So there are lots of respects in which, you might think, well, this is just ridiculous. Why on earth are they still using this thing? But before we all, start laughing at them too much, there's a good reason why they're still using it. It's methodologically sticky because when you conduct your new study, you want it to be comparable to the existing studies, right? So you want people to be able to draw the connections between what you're doing and what everybody else has previously done. It's the same problem we have in philosophy, where certain topics of people get especially sticky, and they just become reference magnets in the sense that you have to refer to them, or you're not really doing the thing everyone else is doing. It's like that. You have to use these scales, despite their methodological flaws, so that you can then be included in the meta-analysis of all of the different studies of love that have also used this scale. And this is not just about like what you personally as a researcher feel like doing, but it might well be about what you actually need to do in order to pass peer review muster and get published. Okay, so we can't solve these problems unfortunately, with wishing, but they're there. Okay, so what I'm saying here really is just that the CCC effect on researchers compounds the same effects on the self-reporting subjects. And I am assuming there, of course, that the subjects and researchers belong to similar or overlapping social contexts, because that's what will give you the result. And the result I'm talking about, when it really comes down to it, is that both the subjects themselves and the researchers gathering their self-reports are influenced by extrinsic social norms about what romantic love looks like. Certain pictures that they have in their minds about, the stereotypical nature of a romantic love relationship. And so, correspondingly, the results of using these methodologies, the results of these studies are shaped by, and to an extent, a reflection of those extrinsic social norms. Slightly different kind of effect I want to talk about now. And I've sometimes thought about this in terms of telling stories, and that kind of has a sort of double meaning, because what I'm talking about is the idea of telling the story of your life, the narrative of, well, usually your love life in these particular cases, telling a good story. But of course, telling stories can also mean, fibbing a little bit, or at least, rounding things up. And I want to sort of draw attention to the fact that this is liable to happen in a lot of the studies. So the reason why it's so liable to happen is that failing at love, and I'm using a lot of scare quotes here, failing at love is often perceived as failing at life. Here's Bertrand Russell, for example, saying this exact thing. He says, and this is from 1929 from his book Marriage and Morals, that a person who's never experienced what he calls, quotes, mutual sexual love, it turns out he means heterosexual love with your own biological children involved, and you should be married as well, obviously. That person, he has a lot of other interesting views about it, but this one, he says, therefore, that person cannot attain their full stature and cannot feel towards the rest of the world that kind of generous warmth without which their social activities are pretty sure to be harmful. And it gets better. The resulting disappointment inclines them towards envy, oppression, and cruelty. It's really kind of... yes, it's really intense. Oh, yes, he's a pile of interesting contradictions. Good old Bertie. But what I want to draw attention to actually is not... I'm not picking on Bertrand Russell because his views on this are particularly unusual. His views on this are actually extremely common. I'm pointing to him because, unlike a lot of people, he's very good at stating very clearly what he means. So what we have here is just a really good summary of the problem that in much more recent work by Elizabeth Brake has been labeled amatonormativity. And this is basically the idea that a romantic love relationship of a certain kind that that our culture has made normal, that is considered to be the default state for humans, the ideal state for a human life, and the mark against which any kind of human life is measured. So, what does that mean? Well, there's this huge social pressure to succeed by that amatonormative standard, right? And moreover, not just to succeed, but to appear to succeed. So when you're telling, even to yourself, but especially to anyone else, the story of your life and the story of your love life, you get this desire to tell a coherent story and an impressive story. And that's basically the manifestation, one manifestation in this circumstance of all those biases that I mentioned before, the self-serving bias, the wishful thinking, and the confirmation biases. So how does this play out? Well, one instance where I thought I might have detected a little bit of this sort of happening live, as it were, was in that O'Leary et al. 2012 study. In this study, married subjects were asked how intensely in love with their partners they were. And what O'Leary et al. Report is that, and now I'm quoting, unexpectedly, the most frequent response was very intensely in love, right? Women gave that response 46.3% of the time and men 49%. Notably, even for the very longest marriages, right, upwards of 30 years, 40% of women and 35% of men reported being very intensely in love, right? Okay. So they said that this was unexpected. I think actually this is not that surprising. Why? Well, their subjects were located in the US. In the US, there's a very strong social norm. If you are married, especially if you've been married for 30 years, you are meant to be truly, madly, deeply in love with your spouse, right? So it's not surprising if people tell you that that's what's happening, because to admit anything else would be to be admitting to the story of your life not really being a good story, not particularly coherent story, perhaps. And so what I'm saying is that this kind of rounding up that might be going on here, we don't have to think that these people are being deliberately deceptive, right? That they're just out to confuse the stranger who's probably never going to ask them anything ever again about how in love they are. But you would conceive of this as just a normal kind of mild confabulation about what's happened to you. So you can imagine somebody not thinking out loud, but in fact this being what's going on. Why would I have been with him for 30 years if I didn't love him very much? I must love him very much. We call them transcendental arguments, but it's basically, same thing. All right, so why is this kind of thing worrying? Well, in a sense, it's almost not worrying. And I'm going to come back to exactly why I think that in a moment. But what I think it means is that we have to just approach the results that we're getting with a certain kind of sensitivity that I'm not really seeing being done too much at the moment. And the kind of sensitivity that I think is needed is actually sometimes being exemplified in other areas of research, investigation, where self-reporting methodologies are very heavily used. So one example of this comes from a study of gender differences in self-reported sexual behavior, and this is from Alexander and Fisher, 2003. basically we're talking about men reporting more, right, than women, more of certain kinds of sexual behaviors than women. What they noticed when they did, when they looked for it, when they investigated, what they found was that the gender differences were increased when the subjects were not guaranteed anonymity, right, thus intensifying pressure to conform to the socially normative answers. And these effects were decreased when the subjects thought they were being screened with a lie detector, right, so increasing the pressure to tell what was actually the truth. And so the conclusion, as a quote, "These findings suggest that some sex differences found by sex researchers may reflect false accommodation to gender role norms when reporting sexuality." Yes, right, they may well. And so for these studies of love, right, there are different social norms for women and men when it comes to what they're supposed to want out of romantic love. And again, I would refer you to every rom-com ever for the nature of those normative differences. Okay, so that's one kind of example. Another kind of example comes from the science of happiness, where, again, this question of what are you going to rely on if you can't just ask people how happy they are? The same issue arises as it does for love. But a recent study by, not entirely sure how to pronounce that name, but I'm going to go with Wojcik et al., 2015. The study was called Conservatives Report, but Liberals Display Greater Happiness. And what they investigated was this. This was something that was previously known, that conservatives in the US, again in the US, they had higher rates of self-reported happiness than liberals did. But what this study looked at was other measures of happiness. So they looked at, for example, the frequency and genuineness, I have no idea how they measure this kind of thing, of smiles. I'm sure it's covered in the method section. And the deployment of positively valenced vocabulary, I think in social media. So what they were trying to do was get at the very possibility that merely looking at what people self-report might not be, for the full picture, let's put it that way. And what they found was that when you use those other measures, liberals were displaying greater happiness than conservatives. And they also went on to note that the gap in that self-reported happiness could be accounted for, I think they thought it could be fully accounted for, by what they called a self-enhancing style of self-reporting, which is something that is also correlated with holding conservative political opinions. So obviously the intended moral of that kind of study is people are going to tell you stuff and you might want to look for other measures to try and calibrate a little bit, especially if you have reasons related to perhaps social pressure and social norms in the context that you're working within to suspect that there may be patterns of influence on what people will self-report that could be into your results. So that's exactly what this study was designed to look at. And just as with happiness and self-reported sexual behavior, calibration is just hugely, hugely challenging. So even if we stop worrying about all those self-serving biases and so on, so we stop worrying about the accuracy and the reliability of these reports, just how to calibrate them it's incredibly difficult. And I mean, in this arena, we've got to worry about the fact that nobody, I won't say nobody, very few people agree on the question of what it means to say that one is in love, right? Even basic questions about the nature of the phenomenon. What kind of ontological category of thing are we talking about here? Basic questions like that. Very little agreement out there. Most people's theory of love is fuzzy to say the least. And the same, of course, goes for happiness, right? Which is why I think you might expect similar patterning in the two areas. And it doesn't help to switch to using a measurement scale where you ask people whether X will make them happier than anyone else, or how it feels when they look into X's eyes, because the problem's all going to reappear at that level, right? So you ask about how happy are you with X, and then suddenly you've got the happiness problem. Ask about, do you have warm, fuzzy feelings when you look into X's eyes, and then you've got the warm, fuzzy problem. So you can't get around this. So what are you going to do instead of getting around it? This is the part where I'm going to start talking a little bit about metaphysics eventually. So one thing you can do, just advisable anyway, you can try this. You can take an explicitly non-judgmental approach to the subject and indeed the subjects, which, that sounds great, but the problem is what exactly counts as being non-judgmental as opposed to simply making a judgment about what the nature of love is. Any study, any researcher's assessments of whether they're being judgmental about their subjects are going to be, again, heavily shaped by the prevailing social norms. So, of course, everyone should try to do this. It's unlikely to help very much. One thing you can do, of course, is you can assure subjects of anonymity and safety if you want to get more honest answers. You could try telling them that they're going to be screened with a lie detector, but A, that might scare more people off, and B, I think most people know now that those don't actually work. Right? So, well, apart from, most people know that that doesn't actually work. So you can also avoid framing questions in ways that build in assumptions about the nature of love. Again, sounds good, but you can't really do it, right? So it's impossible to frame any question about anything without building in some assumptions. And so if you're going to, for example, try to update the passionate love scale from the 1980s, you would really just be building in your own assumptions about what the symptoms of love are in order to try to assess whether your subjects are in love. So there's not that, we can identify assumptions that are obvious to us as assumptions, but we can't, of course, see the ones that are our own because that's exactly the point of them being our own assumptions. You could seek out participant groups that aren't comprised exclusively of psychology undergraduates at your own university. Of course, that one is a good idea. You can stop incentivizing particular self-reports. Yes, that one's also a good idea, especially if you're going to use those self-reports to draw out your correlations later in the study. Replication is important. A lot of the controversies in particularly social psychology lately around whether and to what extent the studies that are being done are replicable, can be replicated, is going to bear on the question of how methodologically reliable any of this stuff is. But really, my worry is that these are going to be insufficient measures to overcome all of the issues. Just to pick out a couple of examples, the extrinsic barriers to self-reporting socially disfavored or stigmatized kinds of love will still be there. The social norms for what ideal love should look like, those will still be there and they'll still shape the impact, the ways that the general biases, of self-serving biases, the wishful thinking, confirmation biases, the kinds of impact those have will be shaped by what a good story for your life, for your love life, looks like. And of course, this situation is not unique to the science of love. As I've been kind of going through, I've been drawing comparisons with other areas, but it's still serious. And so, do we have to all just write to Ben Goldacre about how this is bad science and give up on the project? So no, I've given you a few hints already. That's not what I propose that we do. But I do think that the first thing we need to do is stop assuming that there's a single objective or natural phenomenon whose nature is being illuminated by studies like these. Right? The worst risk of people making that assumption is coming out of the studies where people actually are put into the brain scanners, because by the time you've got brain scans coming out as the results and people showing you pictures of brain scans and saying, look, these are the areas of your brain that are active, the input of self-reporting methodologies has been forgotten, and all people see is, oh, that looks extremely scientific and natural and objective, and now I'm seeing the biology. So those are the ones where we have to be the most careful about assuming that there's an objective natural phenomenon underlying all of this. Basically, we just need to approach the results with awareness of what they track. Awareness, that is, that whatever we're learning about has been shaped by social norms. And many factors are pulling together in that direction. So the comfortable, clear case effects, the selection effects, the particular impacts of self-serving biases, etc., on the narratives, the stories people tell when you ask them about their lives and their loves. Okay, so here's a possibility. We could describe this as the science of social norms for romantic love, or maybe we could describe it as the science of normal love, or even better, because what's normal in inverted commas is not often statistically normal, we could call this the science of normative love. I don't imagine for a minute that any scientist is going to agree to do that, but that's basically what I think we should do. Now, I'm a bit of a social constructionist about romantic love, and this is where the metaphysics comes in. So I think the nature of romantic love is partly, but very importantly, determined by this social script that we write for a romantic relationship. So the upshot, I can talk more about that in Q&A if anyone wants to, but the upshot of that is I actually think that the science of romantic love can be information about love's real metaphysical nature. But of course, everyone who disagrees with me about the metaphysics will disagree with me about that point as well. So best terminology for what's going on here is that it's the science of normative love. And this is the way I summarized it in the written form of this paper. So I'm just going to read it because I can't think of a better way to rephrase this. So I said it this way: contemporary scientific studies of a romantic love considered en masse are best viewed as being, in the first instance, a kind of large-scale first-person plural self-report, right? They're some kind of us self-reporting, right? And they capture, broadly speaking, how love, romantic love, is currently perceived and storified, right, made into a coherent narrative by a certain kind of us. As such, they're a source of information about social and cultural norms for romantic love, information that is important and valuable, but only if we know what to make of it and we don't inflate it into something that it's not. Okay. Last couple of things. I know I'm a little bit short of time, so I'm just going to flag a couple more things, and I'm very nearly done. Even so construed, of course, the science is flawed, right? Worries about calibration, worries about ambiguity, all those sorts of things still there. But that's, every human intellectual endeavor is flawed. And speaking of flawed human intellectual endeavors, this is a book that will exist soon. It's called What Love Is and What It Could Be, and it contains my metaphysical theory of romantic love. So if anybody does want to know more about that, the book will exist in January, or you can ask me in the Q&A if you want to. And at this point, I'm going to stop. Thanks very much.